their protection has departed from them. This was not an emotional claim. It was not wishful thinking. It was not manufactured confidence designed to boost morale of the people in camp. This was spiritual discernment. In the ancient world and throughout scripture, protection or covering was understood as the result of alignment with a divine authority. We tend to equate what looks powerful with what actually is powerful. But Joshua and Caleb, on the other hand, they had been with God long enough. They had built enough history with God's character that they could look at something that appeared unchallengeable and recognize that its covering was gone.
Yeah, so really, this wasn't just about them being courageous. They were seeing the situation differently.
I believe there were spiritual clarity that came from a deep, sustained relationship with the character of God. See, when you know who has ultimate authority, you can actually assess who doesn't. The enemy is real. Spiritual opposition is real, but it is also limited. And I think that people either overestimate the opposition or underestimate it. And both are problems. Have you ever faced something like an obstacle, or maybe an opposition, or a person, maybe even a system or a circumstance that looked absolutely unchallengeable? Like, this thing is just too powerful. Maybe it is too established to be moved. And maybe you've prayed about it. You've trusted God. You've kept showing up day after day. And it still looked exactly the same. What if I told you what looks impenetrable from the outside might actually be exposed from the inside? What if the thing that looks strongest against you is actually standing without a covering? That's what Joshua and Caleb saw that nobody else in the camp was able to see. And today on this episode, we're going to see that exactly the way they saw it as well. Welcome back to Align Podcast. On the last episode, we slowed down and sat with one truth. The Lord is with us. On this episode, we'll pick back up on the other side of the same coin. If the Lord is with us, then what does that mean for what stands against us? This episode is titled, The Opposition Has No Protection. And the question we're answering is, what does it mean that the opposition has no protection? Or what does it mean that the opposition's protection has departed from them? And how does that change how we face resistance in our world today? Let's get into it. Picking up in Numbers chapter 14, verse 9, reading from the New King James Version, I'll read from here. It says, "Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." We've spent several episodes unpacking different parts of this one statement. And on this episode, we land on 5 specific words. Their protection has departed from them. This was not an emotional claim. It was not wishful thinking. It was not manufactured confidence designed to boost morale of the people in camp. This was spiritual discernment. Joshua and Caleb saw something that the 10 spies couldn't see, that the inhabitants of the land, for all their visible strength, were spiritually uncovered. And that one thing changes everything.
Okay, so let's start there. When Joshua and Caleb said their protection has departed from them, what exactly did it mean? Like, what protection were they really talking about?
That's actually a good place to start. See, in the ancient world and throughout scripture, protection or covering was understood as the result of alignment with a divine authority. So when a people or a nation, when they live in accordance with God's purpose, or even within the framework of the natural order as God designed it, there was a measure of covering. But when a people set themselves against the declared will of God, when they stood in the way of what God was doing, They were effectively standing without that covering.
Okay, so even though the Canaanites looked strong, spiritually, they were actually exposed.
Yes, they were exposed. Their walls were still high. Their warriors were still large. Their cities were still fortified. But none of that visible strength was backed by a divine covering. And that's what Joshua and Caleb were able to discern. They were able to discern the difference between the visible strength and the spiritual authority.
And I think that's where it can get tricky because naturally we tend to believe what looks powerful is powerful.
Yeah, most people do. Most people believe that what is powerful is powerful because we tend to equate what looks powerful with what actually is powerful. But Joshua and Caleb, on the other hand, they had been with God long enough. They had built enough history with God's character that they could look at something that appeared unchallengeable and recognize that its covering was gone.
Yeah, so really, this wasn't just about them being courageous, they were seeing the situation differently.
I believe they were spiritual clarity that came from a deep, sustained relationship with the character of God. See, when you know who has ultimate authority, you can actually assess who doesn't. It will be obvious. It will be clear who doesn't have that authority.
Okay, so I want to ask something quickly because I think this is a fair pushback. When we start talking about spiritual covering and oppositions being exposed, I think we have to be very careful because you can get to a place where every difficulty is a demon and obstacles become spiritual warfare. And that's fine. But how do we find the balance though?
The balance. I'm glad you asked it before we went any further because the point of this episode is not to send anyone into a heightened state of spiritual alarm. The enemy is real. Spiritual opposition is real, but it is also limited. And I think that people either overestimate the opposition or underestimate it. And both are problems. Overestimating or underestimating it is a problem.
Yeah. Okay. So what does it look like when we overestimate it, like you say?
Okay, for overestimating looks like treating the enemy as if he has more power than he actually has. Like seeing a spiritual adversary behind every difficulty or living in a posture of constant spiritual combat that produces anxiety rather than authority. Giving the enemy more of your attention, your conversation, your mental real estate than he deserves. He actually does not deserve that much mental real estate. That's what overestimating looks like.
And what about the other side? Like, what does underestimating look like?
Underestimating, on the other hand, looks like ignoring the reality of spiritual opposition entirely. It looks like treating every difficulty as purely circumstantial, never discerning when resistance is actually targeted, when discouragement is actually a strategy, when the pattern of attack in your life is not coincidental. See, just before recording this episode, there was this level of discouragement that I felt towards recording. I could have made a choice not to or push it to another day, but you've got to understand that in those simple moments, choosing to see it as coincidental and just making yourself feel comfortable can be a way of underestimating spiritual opposition.
Okay, I like that. So take it seriously, but don't make everything all about spiritual warfare.
Yes. Take it seriously and keep it in proper proportion. Colossians 2 verse 15 gives us the frame for that proportion. It says, having disarmed principalities and powers, he made an open spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. Christ disarmed them.
Disarmed. That is a strong word.
It is the strongest possible word. The enemy has been disarmed, not weakened, not put on a temporary leash, but disarmed. Through the finished work of Christ, the cross, the resurrection, see, the enemy's ultimate authority has been stripped. He cannot change the outcome. He cannot undo that defeat. What he can do, and what he actually does, is attempt to convince us that the defeat hasn't happened.
Yeah, which means a lot of what he does depends on getting us to believe that something isn't true.
Exactly. His primary weapon is always deception, not power, because he has already been stripped of that power. His power is already limited. Definitely not authority, because his authority has been taken away. What he has the ability to do is to create illusions of invisibility, illusions of inevitability, illusions of impossibility. And if those illusions are more real to you than the finished work of Christ, then they function as if they were real.
Oh, yeah. And that's exactly what happened with the 10 spies.
That's exactly what happened with the 10 spies. The Canaanites' greatest weapon against Israel was not their armies. It was the 10 spies' fear. The giants didn't defeat Israel. Israel's own perception of the giant was what defeated them.
Wow. And, because the battle hadn't even happened yet, but in their mind, they had already lost.
That's it. The enemy wins not by overpowering you. Again, he has no power, but he wins by out-narrating you. If he out-narrates you, he gets you to tell yourself stories about your situations, a story that excludes God from it, a story that exaggerates his own power and ends with you retreating before you even fight any battle.
That's really interesting. So what would you say actually takes away the enemy's leverage then? If deception is his primary weapon, what breaks all of that?
Obedience.
Okay. Please explain that a little bit more.
See, okay, when Joshua and Caleb said their protection was departed from them, they were observing the spiritual reality of a people standing outside of God's will. The inverse of that is also true. When you walk in obedience to God, when you move in alignment with His word, when you move in alignment with the purposes of God, when you move in the calling of your life that God has placed upon you, you are under His covering. And that covering strips away the enemy of his primary leverage.
Yeah, but why obedience specifically? That's what I'm really trying to understand.
Because the enemy's greatest point of access is the gap between what God has said and what you are actually doing. Hidden rebellion, as we talked about it in episode 4, they create an exposure. Unconfessed sin creates an exposure. Sustained disobedience creates the spiritual equivalence of leaving a door open, a door that was meant to be closed, by the way. But obedience, I'm talking steady, consistent, sometimes costly obedience, closes those doors. It removes the leverage point which the enemy has access to. It narrows the access and makes sure that we are closer to God than if we disobey, than if we don't follow through with what He has already said.
Okay. That makes me think about holiness differently, It's not just about living right. There's also protection in all of it.
It's both, and scripture presents it as both of them. Isaiah 54 verse 17 says, no weapon formed against you shall prosper. But the promise is set in the context of righteousness, the righteousness of walking in God's way. The protection is not independent of the walk. The walk and the covering are connected. You have to be walking alongside the path. You have to be walking on the path that the Lord has carved out for you in His purpose, in His calling for your life. The walk and the covering are connected.
And I think that distinction really matters because we quote, "No weapon formed against me or you shall prosper," all the time. But sometimes we can quote the promise without really considering how we're living, you know?
And I understand why. But the full counsel of Scripture presents the covering as connected to the covenant, to the posture of a life that is oriented towards God, not perfection. God is not waiting for flawless performance before He covers you, but He's looking for direction, that you are actually walking in the direction He has provided, a life that is genuinely pointed towards Him. That is a life that is honest when it fails, a life that repents, a life that returns to Him, a life that keeps moving in the direction of obedience. That is a life that gets covered.
Okay, so let's make this practical because how do I know in a real situation that what I'm facing is actually spiritual opposition? Like, how do I know when this principle applies?
I will consider that the discernment question, and it's the right one to ask. I'll give you 3 markers. The first, ask whether the opposition is aligned with or against the declared will of God. If what stands against you is standing against what God has clearly called you to, you can be confident that it doesn't have the divine backing. Joshua and Caleb knew God had promised the land. So anything that stood between Israel and the land that God already promised, by definition, was standing against what God already declared, was standing against God's purpose for them. Things that stand against what God has declared don't have the covering of God.
Oh, man. Okay, so what's the second?
Ask whether the resistance is producing fruit or if it's just noise. Sometimes what looks like opposition is actually God's redirection. A closed door, for instance, that feels like resistance might be a protection, but opposition that is genuinely spiritual, that is targeted against your obedience, that is targeted against your calling and your faithfulness, they tend to produce discouragement. They tend to produce confusion, and they tend to pull you away from God. That's the signature of the enemy. Not just that it's difficult, but that it specifically pulls you away from God. It specifically pulls you away from God's purpose over your life.
Oh, wow. That's so good. Because not every closed door means that the enemy is fighting you. Sometimes God is the one saying no from what you're saying. All right. And so now what is the third one?
Ask whether you are walking in the kind of obedience that positions you under God's covering. Not because God's protection is contingent on your perfection, but because self-examination is always a wise starting point, especially when you're facing sustained resistance. Is there anything giving the enemy leverage here? Anything unconfessed? Anything unaddressed? Anything unresolved? If yes, address it. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. And once you've done that honest examination, then you can stand with what Joshua and Caleb did. You can stand and you can declare with confidence their protection has departed from them. The Lord is with us. We will not fear. Let me speak to you directly. Maybe you're facing something right now that feels unchallengeable. A situation that has gone on so long it feels like it's permanent. Maybe an opposition that looks so established, so powerful, so immovable, that you've quietly started to believe maybe it can't move or maybe it cannot be moved. I want to offer you something different, maybe a different frame. What looks strongest from the outside may already be exposed from the inside. The thing that's standing against what God has promised you, if it is standing against the declared will of God, that thing is standing without a covering. Not because you're powerful, but because God is powerful. Not because your strategy is superior, but because of the finished work of Christ. that finished work of Christ has already disarmed everything that stands against you. See, the enemy's greatest hope is that you will look at the visible size of the opposition and never look at the spiritual exposure. That you will be so focused on how tall the giants are that you never notice that they are standing uncovered. Joshua and Caleb, they noticed. And noticing, that's genuinely spiritual discerning, that what stand against you does not have God's backing is one of the most faith strengthening things you can do in a season of difficulty. Here's your reflection question. Where have I been overestimating the power of my opposition? Name the specific opposition. Then ask, is this thing standing with God, or is it standing against God, against what God has already declared? If it is standing against what God has declared, its protection has already departed. Move accordingly. Move in faith. Step like you understand the power that is backing you. And that's episode 8. The opposition has no protection. We're almost at the end of this season, only 2 episodes left. Now, on the next episode, we're going to look at the cost of letting fear win. Not just personally, but generationally. And we're going to answer the question that I think this entire season has been building up towards. What does it actually look like to move forward in faith? What does it actually look like to move forward in faith? Not in theory, but in practical, with your specific next steps. I think this is going to be one of the most action-oriented episodes of this season. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Until then, cheers.